everyone, we are moving on to the final chapter of our lesson. This is looking at the end of the Cold War. All right, now in this chapter, we'll be focusing on how the Cold War comes to an end. All right, we will begin by talking about the decline of the USSR in the 1970s and the 1980s and how this eventually leads to the end of the Cold War. Okay? So there are various factors that contributed to the decline of the USSR. Firstly, the weakness of the Soviet economy. Secondly, opposition to communism in Eastern Europe. And thirdly, you have the Brezhnev doctrine. And last but not least, you have aging leadership, all of which contributed to the decline of the USSR. Now, in this first part of the lesson, we will be looking at the weakness of the Soviet economy and opposition to communism in Eastern Europe. Okay? So, what was Soviet economy like before the 1970s? All right, now Soviet Union had something known as a command economy, meaning that the state would make decisions about the economy. All right, so the state would decide which areas of the economy would receive investment, which areas of the economy would be developed. All right. Now, in addition to that, it also controlled resources such as oil, coal, and energy. Okay. Last but not least, it also controlled production, prices, wages, and all other vital aspects of the economy. So when we talk about the command economy, the individual had little or no say in what the economy looked like, what production looked like, what and where investment should be, where investment should be placed, all right? So the individual played no role in that, okay? All decisions were made by the state. Now, for much of the USSR's existence, the command economy appeared to be achieving its main aims. All right, so let's start off by looking at what the USSR looked like in the 1920s, all right, when communism first began in USSR. What kind of economy was it really? Okay, so USSR was a relatively backward, all right, society, and its economy was largely rural economy. Now, what does that mean? A large part of the Soviet population was actually, their economy came from farming. All right, so there was a lot of farmers, very few city workers. All right, so it's not common to see in the early 20s huge cities with huge factories and all that. All right, it was really largely farmers working on their small pieces or parcels of land. Okay, not surprisingly, much of the population lived in extreme poverty and in squalor-like conditions. Now, what does that mean? It was very crowded, hygiene level was very low, all right? So people tended to live in such, in such circumstances at that time. Education was actually very rare. And in those days, if you were wealthy, you could afford to send your children to receive an education. But otherwise, many of them in Soviet Union could not read or write for that matter. So literacy level was actually very low. Okay, given the fact that they lived in such poor living conditions, people, when they fell sick, and if it were to be an infectious disease, all right, it spread very quickly. Okay, so there was high rates of death from diseases. There was also high levels of alcoholism because a lot of them became alcoholics because they wanted to escape from the harsh life that they led, and they became alcoholics. And then it was a downward spiral from then on. Okay, so you can imagine how people actually suffered. From 28 to 1940, you see that there was significant effort taken by the USSR government to actually transform USSR from an agrarian society to a modern industrial power. And this was done because of Stalin's determination, all right, to transform Soviet economy, and he really wanted Soviet economy to be equal to that of the West. Okay, so there were a lot of efforts to actually transform Soviet economy into a modern one. By the 1940s, the USSR did become a modern economy. There were lots of industries, infrastructure, such as roads, railways, dams, and power stations were built. There was a developing public education system. In fact, education became kind of like compulsory, all right? They needed to receive compulsory education until a certain age, all right? This was to ensure that there was an increase in literacy, okay? Soviet economy before the 1970s. Again, I want to mention that there was rapid transformation in the way that the Soviet Union looked like. All right. Now, this is actually Magnitogorsk Steelworks. Is one of the Soviets' impressive projects in the industrial sector. So, what was this Magnitogorsk? All right. So, it's basically the construction of industries. All right, to transform what do you call that, the city area, urban area, into a modernized modernized society. All right. So let's learn a bit more about Soviet economy. For much of the USSR's existence, the command economy appeared to be achieving its aim. So in the early days, it looked like, oh wow, command economy is really working. Okay. Let's take the USSR and in what do you call that, in its battle against the Nazi Germany in World War II. Now, despite the immense loss of life and damage to property, USSR was able to defeat Nazi Germany, of course, with the support of USA and its allies, but nonetheless, it was able to hold its own and face Nazi Germany, okay? And you do see that that is an upward trend in the 50s and the 60s, all right? There was continued economic growth, okay? And on top of that, the Soviet leaders guaranteed jobs, good health care, a place to live, and free education to the university level. All of this was promised to the people. But you find that by the late 1970s, Soviet economy begins to experience a steady long-term decline in terms of the rate of growth. Okay, let's take a look at the industrial output. Okay, industrial output had dropped from a double-digit percentage growth to a 3 to 4% decline. Now that's a fair amount of decline, that drop that we're talking about. All right. Now similarly, output growth for Soviet agriculture also dropped from 4.8% a year in the 1950s to 1.8% in the 1970s. Like, this is a 3% drop, okay, in the 1950s, all right, and it's quite scary, okay. Within just a matter of 20 years, you see that the drop is very steep, and it's very fast. The future Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev later called this period the era of stagnation, where there was really very little growth, okay? So let's take a look at the Soviet Union's gross domestic product, otherwise also known as GDP. And this refers to the aggregate value of goods and services produced within a country, okay, per capita in US dollars from 1970 to 1990. All right, so we're going to compare the USSR's GDP against that of USA, West Germany, and Japan. Now, you'll notice that these three countries are actually democratic nations. And we're going to compare how USSR fared, okay, in comparison with all these democratic nations. All right, do we actually see communism benefiting the people? Is it leading to economic growth? All right, so that's what we're going to take a look. So in 1970, you see that there's 8,886 GDP, all right, versus you look at America. America has 23,958, and you look at West Germany is 17,277, and Japan is 15,484. Now, if we were to go down the years, you would see that, all right, in every single row, you see USSR not faring as well as the other democratic nations. All right, you see it an increase, but the increase is very slow as compared to USA, West Germany, and Japan. Okay, so you don't really see great growth. It's very, very little growth every other year. Okay? So there was a sharp contrast clearly in terms of the performance of the USSR and the other economies. While the society, while the Soviet economy was growing, please note there is a typo here. This should be Soviet. All right, was growing over the years in terms of its GDP. The rate of growth was not as high as other countries. Okay, it was clear that the USSR was lagging behind. Okay, so I have explained this to you already. Okay, now let's consider what was the reason for this weakness in terms of economic growth. What contributed to it? Okay, so there are actually some reasons that people have concluded as to what contributed to the weakness of the Soviet economy. One is its structural weakness of the command economy. All right, so inherently the command economy had some weakness which actually prevented it from performing very well. Okay, and then on top of that, you have the external burdens on the economy, poor standards of living, and disillusionment of the workforce, all of which contributed to the weakness of the Soviet economy. So we're going to talk about the structural weakness of the command economy. Now, you need to understand that it consisted of a small number of very large industries, and particularly coal, steel, and electricity. Now, by the 1970s, the Soviet economy had grown and expanded and became overwhelmed by the increasing demands. So demands grew higher, but it was not able to meet the demands. The supply was not coming in fast enough to meet the demands of the various companies, all right? So it struggled to cope with many companies making different goods. Okay, it acted too slowly, made very poor decisions. Okay, it was very slow to bring new technology into its industries. So they did not really use a lot of new technologies would have enabled it to become more efficient. Okay, so because of that, they were not able to cope with the demands. Okay. Now, on top of that, you have something called external burdens on the economy as well. Now, the USSR was fighting many proxy wars at that time. It found itself morally obligated to support its allies, such as the Arab states in the Middle East and Fidel Castro's Cuba. All right, so the Soviets, what were they doing? They were providing money, technical support, providing military advisors, food and medical supplies to many of its allies. Now, as a result, these increased the financial burdens, especially when the war in Afghanistan broke out in 1979. The USSR invested far too much in its military power, such as the nuclear weapons program. So a lot of money was going into one particular sector of the USSR government, okay, and you find that that was becoming a burden on Soviet economy. Okay, now it was estimated that 30% to 50% of Soviet resources went to the military, and that's like nearly half of the Soviet resources, if you're looking at 50%, all right? The large financial strain on the Soviet economy prevented the resources from being channeled to other areas of needs. So I am investing so much in military that the areas that require the financial assistance was not receiving them as much as they needed to, all right? They were not getting what they needed, okay? And sometimes they were slow in coming as well. Then the other thing is the poor standard of living, all right, in USSR, okay? The command economy prioritized industry and military spendings over consumer goods. Workers' wages were not increasing. The consumer goods were rare, and Soviet people could not afford these, all right? So this kind of things lowered the standard of living, okay? When you talk about consumer goods, we're talking about goods that are not necessarily very expensive, some things that they might need, like for example, winter clothings, proper footwear during winter season. So that was, even this was not produced sufficiently in order to meet the people's needs, all right? Let's move on to the US non-communist countries. Now, US focused on consumer goods, where Americans had cars, telephones, televisions, washing machines and other devices, and they had higher standards of living. Now, you would expect this to be available to the Soviets as well, but unfortunately, they could not afford all of this. Okay, which is kind of, you can see that USSR generally had poor standards of living. The overinvestment in the military meant that there was less money that could be pumped into areas such as education, research, and development in universities. All right, so that was resulted in minimal economic growth in the country. Okay, so there's more investment placed in areas such as education, research, and development in universities. Okay, and they resulted in producing economic growth in the country, and this was in the case of the US non-communist nations. All right, they had enough funds to place in all these areas, and not surprisingly, economic growth flourished because they found efficient ways of using technology to actually grow their economy. Okay, so last but not least, we are talking about the disillusionment of the workforce. Many Soviet workers became disillusioned with the system because there was so much of corruption. Many workers found their bosses were appointed due to personal connections. So you can clearly see that there was nepotism or even bribes. So think about it this way. All right, communism was set out to actually be a fair system for all, but in the end, it did not deliver on the promise that it made. So now you have corruption, there was nepotism, all right, and even bribery, okay, which all of this clearly showed that this was not giving them what they needed or what was promised. Wages were also tightly controlled, so there was very limited incentives for many workers to actually work hard, because the big question in their head was, why do I have to work hard when I'm not going to see any recognition for my job, or why I'm not going to see any rewards for the hard work that I contribute. Okay, so people did not take pride in their work. The quality of the work was actually quite bad. Okay, anyone who protested or complained that they were not treated fairly, their complaint was not investigated, and there was not any attempts to try and give them a fair solution to what the concerns that they are raising. What happened to them was actually they were risk being arrested by the secret police. All right, and then they will go through a whole cycle of re-education, being monitored, and so on and so forth. So it was not really in their interest to actually raise any complaints. Now, the Soviet people recognized that the system in the US was not perfect, and very few wanted it. Okay? However, they did want improvement in their own system. So it's not that they wanted democracy or the democratic way of life, but they did recognize that they needed improvement in their own system. Okay, so opposition to communism slowly began over time. Okay, now this is our second factor. So we talked about how the economy was not doing well, what are the various factors that contributed to the decline of the Soviet economy. But now we are going to look at why there was growing opposition to communism in Eastern Europe. This was another factor that eventually led to the decline of the USSR. As the Soviet economy was closely tied to the economies of Eastern Europe, through Comecon, it found itself at the helm of an economically weaker alliance. I mean, countries could see for themselves that those that allied themselves with US and the Western allies, they were doing far better than themselves. The Eastern European nations were not doing well. Okay, so in the short run, when the USSR began to struggle, so did some of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, which were very much dependent on Soviet support. Okay, as the Soviet economy was closely tied to the economies of the Eastern Europe through Comecon, they found themselves having a weaker alliance, right? I mentioned this earlier. Okay, so what happens is that Eastern European countries borrowed heavily from Western banks in the 1970s, which eventually attained debt levels which were among the highest in the world at the time. Okay, so think about it this way. If you have countries in Europe that are in debts, Okay, how would this affect the USSR given that their economies are tied closely together? So USSR's economy will also suffer. Okay, opposition of we'll continuing to take a look at opposition to communism in Eastern Europe. Okay, now the USSR had formed the Warsaw Pact with the communist states of Eastern Europe in 1955. Now this was a defensive treaty signed to protect the USSR and its allies from any external threats. But many historians think that its primary purpose was to protect the communist regimes in Eastern Europe from internal threats. Why? Okay. Um, what was the reason for it? Okay, why do you think that many of them felt that it was to protect the communist regimes in Eastern Europe? All right, because there was a lot of protest, there was a lot of uprising, so there was a need to actually contain these rebellions. Now let's look at the case one by one. Protests against communist rules. Hungarian Revolution 1956. After World War II, Soviet forces occupied Hungary and established a communist regime under the leadership of Rákosi. Now, in 1956, widespread protests against the communist regime led to the formation of a new government under nationalist Imre Nagy. All right. Now, when Nagy announced to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact and be a multi-party social democracy, the Soviet tanks troops invaded Hungary and overthrew Nagy's government. Okay, so you can imagine, all right, how there was so much of unhappiness towards communism that there were constant rebellions in the eastern part of Europe, attempts to actually get rid of the government. All right. Now we come to another example, Prague Spring 1968. Now it was a period of liberal reforms in Czechoslovakia under the communist leader Alexander Dubček. Now Dubček believed that the communist regime policies were not working and began to introduce more democratic reforms. Other members of the Warsaw Pact led by USSR invaded Czechoslovakia and crushed the government. Okay, so you can, I mean, it was not something that was unknown to the communist leaders. They realized that they were not doing economically well, pursuing a communist system of government. So why not actually implement reforms and try to help their own people? All right, but of course Stalin would not allow something like this. Okay, so he got rid of the leader, and then he he re-educated them in a sense, right, through reaching out to their leaders. All right. Poland and solidarity, 1970s. This is again the Polish economy hits a crisis as the food prices increased. Now, solidarity led a series of controlled strikes to push for economic reforms and free elections. Okay, so they wanted free elections, they wanted economic reforms. So you have a group of people who are actually trying to organize a strike in order to get what he needs. Okay, so the civilian prime minister Stanislaw Kania was forced to resign for criticizing the USSR, and the leader of the army, General Jaruzelski, took over. In December, Brezhnev ordered the Red Army to carry out training maneuvers on the Polish border. Okay, so Jaruzelski introduced martial law. So martial law means that civil liberties and everything would come to an